he returned to London. Not quietly, not without attention, but the city seemed to hold its breath anyway, as if the very streets understood the weight of what was coming. Prince Harry, a man accustomed to headlines, accustomed to controlling the narrative when he could, stepped onto British soil with a purpose that was quietly urgent, almost desperate. And yet, there was an unease that no carefully staged photograph could disguise. This was the third and final round of a legal battle that had stretched over years, a fight for privacy that had become, paradoxically, impossibly public. And for the first time in a long while, the eyes of the world were not just watching, they were waiting. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You have to ask yourself, what drives a person to pursue a fight they cannot fully control, in a court designed to be impartial, where every gesture is scrutinized, every word dissected? Prince Harry is no stranger to the theater of public life. Yet here, in the quiet corridors of the UK's highest court, the stage is different. There is no script. No one can cue the audience. And the stakes are not measured in applause or criticism. They are measured in permanence. Reputation, authority, the fragile perception of self. All of it hangs in balance. And for someone who has spent years managing image, controlling story, this trial is a mirror he cannot avoid. On Monday morning, the air around the court was thick with anticipation. Not the kind of attention that comes with flashy cameras or screaming reporters, but a different weight, an almost oppressive stillness, the kind that fills a room when something monumental is about to happen. Courthouse staff, clerks, security, all felt the subtle tremor of expectation. Even the press, trained to pounce on a misstep, spoke in quieter tones, aware that they were witnessing not merely a legal proceeding, but the potential unraveling of a narrative long curated. Prince Harry's presence alone altered the energy in the room. And yet, even with cameras rolling, even with journalists scribbling furiously, there was a sense of anticipation that something was about to break beyond the confines of legal argument. This wasn't just another courtroom appearance. Not even close. Previous hearings had been battles, yes, but controlled, carefully planned, rehearsed, shaped. This one, this final act, was different because it carried finality. And finality is something the public rarely witnesses without seeing the human response. Here, the argument was not just about privacy. It was about the intersection of law, personal boundaries, and public scrutiny. Could a prince, a public figure so intensely followed, truly claim a right to be shielded from the relentless gaze of the press? Or was this, as critics suggested, a struggle against the very reality of fame itself? Think about it. What does it mean to fight for privacy when every step you take is already public knowledge? When your arguments are picked apart, dissected, reframed, and broadcast to millions? How do you assert control over something the world already claims? That tension, that fundamental contradiction, defined this morning. And for Prince Harry, it was personal, deeply so. It was not merely a legal challenge. It was, in many ways, an emotional reckoning. Walking into the courtroom, his posture was firm, controlled. But there was a subtle energy in his shoulders, a tautness in his expression, that suggested something beneath the surface. Not anger exactly. Not yet. More like the weight of expectation pressing against every carefully measured movement. Those who saw him described a man quietly determined. But there was also a glimmer of awareness of what was at stake, of the fragility of what could be won or lost in the hours ahead. And in that tension lies the first real question for us as observers. What does a loss mean in a courtroom like this, when the loss is more than legal? It is personal, public, almost existential. Inside, the court itself exudes authority, a presence that is both quiet and commanding. No flashy decor, no theatrics, only the austere gravity of law. It is designed to humble, to impose structure on what is, by nature, a chaotic human conflict. And Prince Harry, like anyone else, could not escape it. There is an irony here that cannot be overstated. A man who spent years navigating royal protocol, public appearances, and the scrutiny of tabloids, now facing a system where every nuance of his argument, and every falter, is magnified under impartial eyes. Control is limited, influence reduced, narrative only partially manageable. And for someone used to managing narratives so meticulously, this limitation carries a weight that is almost physical. But why does this matter now? Why does this moment hold significance beyond the courtroom walls? The answer is layered. First, there is the legal finality. This is the last active trial against Britain's tabloids regarding these privacy claims. No more hearings. No more procedural delays. Second, the emotional weight. Prince Harry, by all accounts, invested heavily, not just in legal fees, but in belief that justice could be found within the parameters of law. And third, the public implications. The outcome shapes how future privacy cases will be approached, sets precedent, and subtly redefines the relationship between the monarchy and media scrutiny. The ripple effects will be felt far beyond this narrow courtroom, and yet, in the moment, it was almost imperceptible. A quiet tension under an otherwise orderly morning. Consider the contradiction. Prince Harry fights for privacy in a courtroom that, by its very nature, demands visibility. Every motion recorded, every expression noted, every argument broadcast to the public. Privacy here is performative, a concept being defended through exposure. And perhaps this is why so many observers describe the atmosphere as tense, strange, almost paradoxical. Here was a man seeking to shield personal life while participating in one of the most intensely public arenas imaginable. And yet, within that tension, there is clarity. There is a human story emerging, one not about law and abstraction, but about a man confronting forces beyond his control. And the audience, us, watching from a distance, feels the pull. We are drawn in not merely by curiosity, but by a sense of impending consequence. Something is poised to happen that will redefine the narrative entirely. And then there is the sense of inevitability. By midday, subtle shifts began to appear. Observers noted the micro-expressions, the changes in tone, the body language of lawyers and judges alike. In moments like these, it is almost impossible to separate human reaction from procedural outcome. And here, the human element is what draws the eye. A jaw tightened, fingers drumming lightly. A pause before response. Not dramatics, simply human instinct reacting to tension. And that is when you realize this trial, this confrontation, is more than legal maneuvering. It is a live emotional landscape, unfolding moment by moment, quietly, yet with consequences that will echo far beyond the room. Now, think for a moment. How often do we get to witness this? The slow unraveling of expectation, the human response to authority, the subtle collapse of carefully constructed confidence? It is rare. It is uncomfortable. It is compelling, because it asks questions without answers. Questions like, what is the cost of being famous, of being constantly scrutinized, of fighting battles that cannot be won quietly? What does it take to maintain composure when the very environment conspires to strip it away? And most pressingly, what happens when the fight you thought you could control begins to slip? Just a little, at first, and then more noticeably, until the loss feels both personal and unavoidable? By the time the opening arguments began, there was an almost imperceptible shift in the room. You could see it in the way attention sharpened, in the small movements, in the way words began to carry weight differently. Observers, accustomed to procedural monotony, sensed a deviation. Something was occurring that neither side could fully anticipate. And as the arguments unfolded, each word, each pause, each judicial gesture carried an extra resonance, an amplified importance. It was as though the courtroom itself had acknowledged that this was not a routine day of law. Something had already changed, and everyone there knew it. Yet, even with all this tension, there remained ambiguity. Observers disagreed on what signals truly mattered, what implied advantage or disadvantage. And this uncertainty is precisely what makes the story so compelling. The audience is drawn into the human calculus of expectation, into the question of what is visible versus what is unfolding beneath the surface. For Prince Harry, that calculus was intensely personal. For the public, it was an invitation to witness a rare collision of human emotion and institutional authority. And for both, the unfolding drama promised to have consequences neither could entirely predict. But the most striking element of this morning, the element that would be remembered later, quietly, almost offhand, in snippets of reporting, was not in the ruling itself, not yet. It was in the subtle, human reactions that presaged what was to come. A tightening of the jaw, a controlled exhale, a hand brushing against a table with just enough force to betray tension. These moments, almost invisible at first glance, would become the focal point of discussion. They were the markers of a shift, the early signs of a conclusion that no one had fully articulated but that everyone instinctively recognized. And for those watching, the question became immediate. If the smallest gestures can reveal the outcome before it is declared, what else is being signaled that we cannot yet see? And here, perhaps, is the most haunting part. We are observers, and yet we are implicated. The anticipation, the tension, the quiet suspense, it is shared. We watch, and we feel the stakes as if they touch us, as if the loss or victory, though not ours, carries weight nonetheless. Prince Harry's presence, his posture, the silent drama unfolding. All of it is a reflection of a universal human truth. That confrontation, in its purest form, strips away control, exposes vulnerability, and demands recognition. We sense it. We understand it, even at a distance. And that is why we are drawn in, why we lean forward, why we ask ourselves, what will happen when the final verdict falls? Because by the time the court adjourned, by the time the ruling was formally announced, the room had shifted in ways no one fully anticipated. And Prince Harry, standing on the edge of a personal and public precipice, would soon make a decision that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom steps. A decision that, as observers, we could only begin to piece together, moment by moment, from expression, posture, and gesture. He arrived on a gray, overcast Monday morning, the kind of London weather that feels heavier than usual, as though the clouds themselves are aware of the tension threading through the city streets. Prince Harry's flight touched down quietly, but the air around Heathrow seemed to hum with a muted urgency. Not the chaos of paparazzi scrambling for photos, not the usual circus that follows a royal, but a focused, almost clinical attention. Those who saw him noticed it immediately. The measured steps, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the faint set of his jaw. He was a man entering a battlefield he could not fully see, stepping into a legal arena with all its rules, and yet none of its guarantees. What made this visit different from his previous returns wasn't the press attention, and it wasn't the court itself. It was the context, the weight of finality. He had already fought and lost, or partially won, through the earlier rounds. This was the third, the ultimate confrontation, and the last legal stage where hope, carefully nurtured over years, could still be asserted. Everything else beyond this point would be outside the courtroom: interpretation, opinion, and public narrative. In a sense, the city itself seemed to lean forward, aware that the story was reaching a conclusion, and that conclusion carried a weight far beyond the pages of any newspaper. The streets leading to the court were lined not with protesters, not with cheering crowds, but with quiet observation. Security vehicles moved with a deliberate calm, keeping both distance and presence. There were whispers among passers-by, a prince in town, a trial underway, and the subtle question on everyone's mind: what would happen today? Because this wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about something deeper, something fundamentally human. Pride, expectation, and the undeniable exposure of vulnerability. As he stepped from the car, his gaze momentarily swept over the courthouse. The building itself is austere, imposing, almost indifferent. Its stone walls, carved decades ago, seem impervious to human drama. Yet, within those walls, human lives are contorted and bent by law, by precedent, by interpretation. Prince Harry was walking into that crucible, fully aware of its impartiality and its coldness. The air of London that day carried more than rain. It carried anticipation, almost a weight that seemed to press against anyone daring enough to confront the courts in such a public way. Observers would later note his posture, the subtle signs of tension that belie calm composure. It is a rare skill to mask apprehension in the presence of scrutiny, and Prince Harry has mastered that over years of life lived under lenses and judgment. And yet, even he was not immune to the subtle pressure of returning to London for this particular trial. Every step forward felt both necessary and dangerous. There is a quiet contradiction here, one that many outside the royal orbit might not immediately grasp. He had sought privacy, Yet he had to confront the very public legal structures designed to adjudicate, monitor, and ultimately expose. It was a paradox, perhaps the central paradox of this legal journey. Fighting for privacy in a context that magnifies every word, every movement, every hesitation. And the questions it raises for the observer are immediate and unsettling. How do you protect something so personal when the very process of protection demands exposure? How do you maintain control over narrative when authority itself is indifferent to emotion, intent, or public sympathy? And most pressingly, how does a human, under immense pressure, process the anticipation of loss when it looms so openly? Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere is almost imperceptibly different from lower courts, where procedural repetition can dull emotion. Here, in the UK's highest court, every detail matters. Every gesture, every inflection, every pause carries a weight. And those attending the trial, legal teams, court staff, even observers, quickly recognize subtle shifts in energy. One raised eyebrow from a judge, one pause before a response, can signal more than any verbal argument. Prince Harry, fully aware of this dynamic, carried the tension lightly on his frame like a well-fitted coat.